we are going to look today at embellishments for the NAF. So what is an embellishment? So an embellishment is an extra detail that's added to something that already exists to make it more interesting or attractive. So to embellish is again to add a decorative detail, to make something like a story more interesting by adding these details, or like a building could have embellishments on it. And in music, this would be decorating or embellishing a note or part of a phrase, which is a set of notes. Now, you may be asking, well, why am I differentiating between note and part of a phrase, which is a set of notes? Because sometimes we want to embellish just a note, and sometimes we want to do something to bring out a phrase in itself. And we'll see examples about this. So why do we embellish? Well, the main reason is surprise and delight, because obviously we want to add a little something to the song that we're playing. Another big reason is to create variation in material that's already been heard. So this may be if you repeat the section, or if there's a specific tune that comes back. We create a little variation by embellishing it to make it more interesting the second time, as opposed to just note for note repetition. To add movement to a line, to call attention to an important note. This is a little more wiggly with the Native American flute, because the Native American flute is not necessarily working with chords underneath it, and usually the important note is part of a chord that's of importance. But it does still kind of exist. And then a big reason is because you are inspired to do so in the moment. I have to be very honest that sometimes the embellishments that I like the most that I do are embellishments that I'm just playing. I play the song many, many times, and suddenly I hear something, and boom, I just play it. It's just this instantaneous thing. And that's where you really want to go eventually, where they just sort of come out of you in the moment. So now, why don't we embellish? Well, we don't embellish to shock and awe. We don't want to do that because it's leading towards showing off. And, we don't want to embellish something just to show off. We don't want to embellish because we can. I mean, yes, of course we can. We do lots of things, but we want to be tasteful about this. Or because you think you have to. I encounter a lot of people that feel like they have to put embellishments in. And you don't necessarily have to, at least not all the time. It's not like all the cool kids are doing it, so we need to do it too. So, all right. So to me, one of the metaphors that I use with my students is that embellishment is like seasoning for food. So if you add a little salt or pepper to your food, it'll bring out the flavor. But what happens if you put a ton of it on? Like you put a ton of salt, it'll ruin it. And embellishment is the same thing. So we also embellish to taste. Art is about taste, but good taste is required. And so if you embellish a lot, and I have recordings and have heard people that embellish all the time, and after a while it just gets tiring. It's just too much. And I'm sure most of you have heard people like that before too. So we want to be tasteful about this. Now, in tonight's session, we're not going to be looking at charts like this. You may have seen these. A lot of people have. These all come from mostly the Baroque period, so that's 1600 to about 1750 when Bach died. And there were these little squiggles and lines and stuff, and you had to look it up in these little charts to interpret what it was. We're not going to do that, so I'm not even going to bother with that. Okay. What we are going to be looking at is embellishments that are notated with grace notes. And this is part of the folk tradition. But actually, in most all modern music now, grace notes are the preferred way of showing an embellishment. Now, some things that we're not going to look at, we're not going to look at vibrato tonight. And vibrato is considered an embellishment, but it's not something that really is for this specific course. We're not going to look at long trills. That's where you're just sitting there going, wiggling your finger for a long time. People know what they are. They're actually a little gaudy in my opinion. So I think they should be avoided, to be honest. And then we're also not going to look at special effects like tonguing effects or flutter tongue or things like that. That's an effect. That's not an embellishment. That's something that's specific to a piece of music. Now, the goals of tonight and next week are to learn the concepts of embellishment, understand how to interpret them from a score, from a piece of sheet music, gain knowledge to how you can create your own embellishments. And like anything in life, the best way to do this is to look at some written down or listen to something you hear in a recording and try to imitate it. This is how most people learn. I mean, this is how I learned embellishment for this instrument. I just started listening to all the recordings I had before I started doing my own recordings. And what are they doing there? And I try to figure it out. And if I liked it, I would sort of remember it. And then eventually it sort of became my own. I would begin to meld them together. Now, not a goal here is that you will be able to play the embellishments like a pro when you're done. Okay, these are very tricky, not only intellectual concepts, but they're hard to do physically if you've never done them. Some people may not have as much trouble as others, but they do require a certain amount of work to get them up to where you're happy with them. So just like playing the flute itself, you can't just learn about something and then do it. It's something that you're going to have to practice and work on and do repetitively over and over and over again, and it'll come eventually. And I find in my own playing, I've been playing now, since the late 1990s, I can tell how my comfort with embellishment sort of changed over time, especially those first 5-6 years. All right, so let's get to the nitty-gritty of the rules of embellishment. There are no rules. Unlike once upon a time, maybe like in the Baroque period when we had all those little charts, there's no rules. You can do really whatever you want. Now there is taste, right? So these are the parts of the guideline I have down here. So we want to use good taste. We want to be thoughtful. We don't want to just wiggle our fingers because we can. We want to kind of have an idea about why we're doing it. And then the last one is to be inspired. Listen for them in your head and play them. You're playing a tune and suddenly you hear a little something and you put it in. Okay? I can't stress this enough. It's really that kind of inspiration in the moment is really, really beneficial. Things to keep in mind about embellishing. You should know the tune without any embellishments. This is true for anything, even the material that I write for myself. Usually I have the tune first and then I start to play with it, right? Because this is the bones of your structure. Again, we're embellishing something that means to add something decorative to something that already exists. So if you really don't know the tune, it's hard to really know what you're doing. You don't want to change your tempo or rhythms to fit in the embellishment. They should slip in as if the music was just being played without them. And so because of this, if you're new to this, slow down. Embellishments add a lot of complexity depending upon how dexterous your fingers are and what your experience is. So again, if you're sort of new to this, cut yourself some slack, slow down a little bit, take a slow tempo when you start so you don't have to alter your rhythms, and know the tunes to begin with so that you know what you're adding to. Okay. So embellishments should not, again, we looked at this before, interrupt the normal rhythm or flow of time. They shouldn't call attention to themselves, so they're not accented. They should not be accented. They should be very graceful. That's, I think, one reason why they call them grace notes. So they should not sound awkward or forced. You want them to sound light. When you're creating your more, these are a couple things that I think are very good to remember. Less is more. So if you have a 16 measure tune and you throw in maybe a couple embellishments in the whole thing, that's better than having a ton, because when they happen, they're like, ooh, that's kind of neat. But if you're doing it all the time, it's not special anymore. If you're coming up with your own and it's hard to play, just discard it. I see this all the time where students will come to me and I'm trying to do this. And usually when they show me, it's just completely hard. It doesn't make any sense. And so therefore, if it's hard to do, and even if you work on it, there's something wrong. Can you give an accent of an accented embellishment? Well, you would play it louder. So if I was going to go, you accent it. That was the question on the chat. Can you play an example of it? So drawing attention to itself. Hopefully that helps. They should sound spontaneous. So they really shouldn't sound like they've been worked out. And complex tunes do not handle embellishments well. Simple tunes do. So if you have a tune with a lot of 16th notes, it's not going to handle embellishments well. There's just not going to be the room to put them in. Very simple open tunes with simple rhythms usually work a little better. And a couple other things to think about. It's rare for tunes or phrases to start with an ornament. So, you don't want to... That's kind of rare. I mean, you do hear that in folk music a little bit, but you are embellishing something that hasn't even started yet. And remember, embellishment is to add to something that exists. I can't remember the last time I saw a written example of this, where a tune started with an embellishment. I just can't recall that. Avoid putting them on long notes, especially at the end of the phrase. Never trill in the long notes. So again, this is my personal preference. You can do what you want to do, but I hear people are like, I think that's gaudy. It doesn't do anything. Vibrato is much nicer and pleasant, I think. Because it's not adding anything to the line. It's just showing off that you can wiggle your fingers. And then avoid needless ornaments for their own sake. And I think that's something that you kind of learn on your own as you get going. All right, let's talk about embellishment names. So the same embellishment can have several names. And likewise, too, I might show you something tonight where another NAF player has said, well, this is what I do, and I call it the same thing that I may talk about tonight. So the name can be different, or the technique can be slightly different. Again, this is sort of, there's no real standardization to this. So if you hear a name and I do something, you're like, oh, I've heard this called that. Don't worry about that. This has been true for hundreds of years. What we call a trill now, Bach didn't call it trill. He called it a shake, right? What we call a turn, they call the cadence. So names, don't get tripped up over names. Pay attention to the embellishment, not the name. Don't worry about that. It's more just sort of what the fingers actually are doing. All right, let's get into the building blocks of embellishments. Okay. So all embellishments for the NAF will have a main note, and this is the note that is being embellished, and then grace notes, smaller notes that show the embellishment. So the main note, and here I picked note 5, that's why I put a 5 underneath it to show that it's the main note. It's part of the tune, and it could be any note. So don't make an assumption here, oh, well, he's put it on the last note, or he's put it on a half note, or he's put it on a 5. No, it's just, I just picked this note at random. And it's a one measure example, so, right. Main notes look like and are regular notes. They're part of the original tune, and they can function without any embellishments. This is, again, knowing the tune and being able to play the tune without the embellishment. The embellishments themselves are shown as grace notes. They're smaller. They are almost always slurred to the main note. And I have to say that the few times I've seen in music where there isn't a slur on the grace note, I think it's an editorial error. Single grace notes will have a slash with a stem, just like the example at the bottom here. Sometimes you'll see multiple grace notes that are beamed together, and they'll have a slash in them. That's really not common, but if you use MuseScore, which is a free notation software, they do that. I usually go in and make it invisible. And then grace notes are not accented, but played like an afterthought, as if falling to the principal note. And again, that's the way you normally hear them. You wouldn't necessarily hear an accented grace note. All right, so here's an example of the embellishment. So we have a grace note. It's slurred to the principal note, or the main note, right? And it is placed graphically in front of that note. And it is also played before the beat of the main note, okay? There is one that comes after, but I'll point that out when we get to it. So if I was to play this, and I'm going to tongue all the notes that don't have a slur in them, so if you were in my articulation webinar, you'll understand what I'm about to say here. Let me play it first without the embellishment, okay? Now I'm going to put the grace note on. So it comes right before. All right. Let me unshare my screen in case somebody wants to actually see what I'm doing there. How do I do that? Stop share. All right. So the example was 4, 5, 5. And now I'm going to put the grace note in. And you'll notice that second 5 happens on the beat it's supposed to. All right. Let me go back to sharing. Share. Okay. That is in the way. Okay. Now, for the Native American flute, most embellishments not only are slurred to the main note, but they are under a slur. So in other words, usually the note before the embellishment and the main note that is being embellished, there's a slur between them. Here I put it between all three. So before I was playing it without the slur, which gave me. Now I'm going to play it with a slur. So it's much softer. Hopefully you can hear that difference. Let me make this screen bigger again. There we go. Now the placement of the grace note indicates the fingering that you will be using to play that grace note. Okay, now this is just a simple example here. Don't really get caught up on this, but so the first grace note's on a 3. And so that means that when I play that embellishment as it's written, or if I just came up with it in my head, I'd be playing that fingering and then drop to the main note. Right? Simple enough. Just like the regular musical tablature system for the NAF that we use, or my number tab, the placement on the staff shows you the fingering. So the next one, the grace note's on the 4. And then the 5, the 7, and then the 8. Technically, they could be anywhere. You could put one over the octave if you wanted. I don't tend to do that. They're sort of kind of awkward, but you could. Now, the grace note can be both above and below the main note. This is how we're going to talk about how you define these, or the names, for example. So, of the 4 examples here, 3 of them are on a 7, but they're going to different notes. One's going to a 4, and one's going to a 3, the last one's going to a 1, and then we have one in the middle there going from 4 to 5. So for the Native American flute, having grace notes above a note that are far away from that note is not uncommon, but usually only one note below, when it's approaching from below, is common. Okay, and we'll talk about this in more detail. The grace notes are not always pentatonic notes. It depends upon the tune. So most of the stuff you might be playing are probably going to be the minor pentatonic. But if you're not, so here's an example. This is in the book. Let me play this without the grace notes here. Do it again. Now I'm going to put the 2 grace notes in, but because the tune has the flat 6 in it, I need to use that. If I did a 7, it would sound awkward. It would throw it out of the normal tune. Let me actually stop sharing for a second so I can show you my fingering for that. Hopefully I can remember the tune. It's just a normal wiggle of the finger. I'm cheating a little bit, but that's in the book. Okay. Let me go on. So we're going to talk first about the single grace note embellishments. And there are three types of embellishments that are displayed with a single grace note. One category is called a tap. And this is where the grace note approaches the main note from below. So the grace note's below the note and it slurs up to the note. The other one's called a cut. And this is where the grace note approaches the main note from above. And it's one note above. There's another one where it's different, where it's more than one note, and that's a chirp, which is a special Native American style flute idiomatic cut. Now the name tap and cut is taken from the Celtic music tradition. So I didn't just make up these names. You may hear them called something else by other players. I just, I need to call them something. So a long time ago, I knew that these were techniques that were named by the people that play Irish flute. Okay. So let's just look at taps to begin with, because I think they're the simplest. So let me sort of explain what we're looking at here. So we have 5 different examples, 5 measures, 5 examples. And we have dotted lines. Those are for slurs, but I'm not being really hardcore about it. I just sort of want to show it just sort of lightly here. Now the tap itself, if we look at the first measure, we have a grace note on a 7 going to an 8. So it's approaching the note from below. So if I played it just by itself, but again, as I said before, usually these are within the context of a tune and it's usually under a slur. So just to make it easy, I'm going to start on the 8 and I'm going to do the tap down, closing one hole and then coming back up. So first let me play it without, I'll just play 2 8s. Now. And why do I want to play them first without it? Because I want you to get a rhythm in your head, because usually these are in time and you want that grace note to happen before that beat. Then the next one is 7 and you're tapping down to 5. Because again, now I'm in the pentatonic scale. And just to let you see what I'm doing here, and by the way, these are in the book, this example. Let me stop sharing so you can see me. All right. So on that first one, I was just holding an 8, and I'm just tapping the top hole that gets me the note below an 8, which is a 7. Okay, so this is why it's called the tap, because you're tapping the hole below it. So if I'm on a 7, which is this fingering, and then I want to play a tap on it, I'm going to go down to the 5, which is closing this hole. Same thing with a 5 to 4. 4 to a 3, and a 3 to a 1. Again, these are in the book, so you should see them there. Now, I should tell you that for the example I put up here, I'm starting with the same note as I'm later tapping after the ornament. But you don't have to do that. It just has to be below the note that you're going to. And we'll look at this in more detail. So let's say I was starting on a 7, I'm sorry, an 8, and I was going to drop down to a 5. Not a 7, but a 5. If I was going to do a tap, I would go to the note below the 5, which is the 4. So I don't have to start on the same note. Or let's say I'm going from 5 to 3. And I wanted to put a tap before that 3. I would close the 1 and then come up. So if I'm doing a line, make sense? Hopefully. All right, let's go back to sharing. Again, grace notes are the one note below the main note, and you tap by closing the hole below the main note. Okay. Now, I'm going to go to some examples, But I wanted to put a warning up here first. Do not make assumptions based on these examples. These are just examples. Most of them have too many embellishments. They're very short. They're only about a measure long. And I began to notice when I was looking at these that, in the time it took me to kind of get the pattern going for that one and only measure, it was usually the grace note was on the last note. And I don't want people to think, oh, they're always on the last note. No, these are just examples. So don't make assumptions, okay? So here's a tap example. It's a simple phrase, and it ends on a 5, and we tap by hitting the 4 before we come up to the 5. So if I play it without it first, then I would tap it by going. Why don't we all try that, okay? And if you're having difficulty, play it without the tap first. Get a feeling for it. Okay? All right. Let's go on. Here's another example. Now we end up at a 7, and I'm tapping a 5 because, again, we're not using non-pentatonic notes. This is all minor pentatonic. So the 5th instead of the 6th is used. So let me play it without it. I'm going to have 2 7s in a row, so I'm going to have to tongue the second one even though it's under a slur. Right? Now I'm going to put the tap in. Pretty straightforward, but it gives you a nice little sound there. Try that. And again, the grace note should be like it's just sort of falling, even though it's going up, like it's falling to the main note. Bum, ba-da. Very light. Okay. Let's go to the third example. So it is common for taps to be against the direction of the line. So in this case, the musical line is going from 8 down to 4. So it is moving down, but the tap is coming up. It's moving in a contrary motion. Okay. And what's really important here is not that the fact that there are 4 notes going down, but that the note before the main note is above it. So we have a 5 above the main note, which is a 4. So it's descending from 5 to 4, and so that we use a tap to come up against it. So if I play this without the embellishment, now I'll put the embellishment on. And this could be true if I made the first 2 notes instead a 3/4. Because again, the 2 notes at the end are going down. All right, why don't you try that? And as always, it's a good idea to play the line without the embellishment first, just to get it in your fingers. So you know where you're going, so therefore when you add to it, you already know what's going on, okay? And your ear is recognizing it. All right, one of the things that I like to use taps for is to break a longer note, usually at the end of a melody or phrase. So in this example, in the second measure, I have taken what once was a whole note and I've split it in half with a tap. So it's just a way to add a little bit more life to this line. It's not really fussy. It's not like a long trill or something. It's just one little sort of thing. So let me play it as if it was, first without the embellishments, and I'm going to play those 2 half notes as if they were a whole note. Okay, so. Pretty long, right? So now I'm going to do it, and I'm going to put the embellishment in. adds a little something to the line. It keeps that pulse going. It's just a little something to add to that note. Let me do it one more time, then we can all do it together. You notice I'm even doing vibrato under it, but you don't have to. Why don't you try that? Good. And by the way, the fact that this is the note before the note that's being tapped is the same pitch, obviously you can go down or up. It doesn't really matter. Now some taps are a little harder to play than others. I think that going from 1 to 3, which the end of this one example shows, is a little tougher. I mean, you're jumping up a minor third, and also it's way down the finger. And some people may think that the first one here, in the first measure, because it immediately goes into 2 eighth notes, might be tricky. And sometimes there'll be 8 notes in front and behind of the embellishment. Let me play this unembellished. Do it again. Now I'll put them in. If anybody wants to see me doing that, just put it up in the chat window and I'll pop out of sharing. Otherwise, give it a shot. Now again, if you find this a little tricky, you can play it slower than I played it. I probably took it a little faster than I should have. Now it's not common for a tap, and we're going to notice this in other embellishments too, it's not common for them to resolve in the same direction as the line. So here, for example, the tap resolves up, right? It's going up to a note above it, but the note before the main note is below it. And it just doesn't sound right. You could do it, but it just doesn't sound right. So let me play this without the embellishment first. Now I'm going to put an embellishment on it. It just sounds awkward. It almost sounds like somebody meant to play the 5 and didn't. Oh, you want me to show you? Okay, yes. I'll go back to that. So this is not something you should do. If anything, I would write this as a dotted 8th note with a 16th note, rather than put an embellishment in. It just doesn't really. Oh, I'm being S switched to G flute. Sure, I can do that. Okay. Let me go back to that example because people are asking to see that. Let's see here. Okay, I'm going to switch to G. I've been asked to switch to G. Hopefully you can tell that I'm being very light with how I'm approaching this. I'm not putting anything, I'm not accenting these embellishments. I'm just sort of lightly playing them. I don't know if that helped. But let me go on. So let's play some taps. Let's go to Little Crow Dance in the handout that I sent you guys. Okay. And again, if you have any questions, please throw them in the chat window. All right, so in Little Crow Dance, this is in the book. And it was also in the second edition too. I wrote this to actually do the technique we're about to start to work on here. So unadorned, it's just very simple, and I've written the articulations in here So for those of you that were in my articulation webinar last month, you'll recognize this. Let me quickly play the tune. It's actually hard for me not to embellish that. I wanted to. Okay, so the second part of that, we have add taps. Now, I've added a lot of taps. There's too many, but this is an example. So the first line, you'll see there's one articulation in the tongue per the slur line, the da. So that means that all the repeated notes we're going to re-articulate using a tap. All right, so. And then one thrown in just for fun. Okay. Let's play that together, maybe a little slower. So 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay. I'm playing with a G flute, by the way, now. Now in the second line, I am sort of mixing it up a little bit. I'm tonguing repeated notes, even though they're under a slur. And you can see that by the first two notes, for example, there's a da under each of them because I have to go da, da to do that same pitch. Otherwise, you won't hear it. And then the fourth note of that first measure, it's also repeated notes. So we're tonguing that. So now I'm kind of mixing this up a little bit. So let me play this first, and then we'll do it together. I have to say, I don't think I would do this normally. I'm just doing it for an example. Let me play that for you one more time, then we'll do it together. This might be a good example of not tasteful. Okay, let's do this together. I'll count in 4 beats. 1, 2, 3, 4. If that seems awkward, it's because it is. So. All right, let's go to the third line. And now we're back to tapping between repeated notes, which almost makes a little bit more sense. So let me play this first. And that last measure, I have taken what was a whole note in the original tune and I've split it in half now. It just sort of keeps the momentum going. Let's play that together. 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, and then let me do the last line. I just realized that there's a mistake in measure 14. I have the tap going down to a 3. Doesn't mean you couldn't do that, it just doesn't make it really an official tap. I have there. It's not like you couldn't do it, but it's a little out of the standards for what you would call that, okay? I may fix that. Okay, let's play this together. I'm going to play a 4 instead of a 3 on that second measure, measure 14. 1, 2, 3, 4. We can only see your upper holes. Technically, you shouldn't really need to see what I'm doing to understand what's going on here. Watching me do this is not going to be as important as listening it. But let me play that last line, which goes down to the lower hole. So. Again, because the music is going to tell you what notes you should be covering and uncovering, the fingering. So, I mean, I understand that people might want to see my fingers, but it's not really going to tell you anything that the music shouldn't tell you already, okay? All right, so we've done with taps. If you have any questions, throw it up there. We're going to go on now to something else. And hopefully you've noticed that I'm going to do this from the simplest to then the most complex embellishments. And we may not get to the super complex ones today. I want to just kind of, especially people that don't have a lot of experience doing this, I want to bring them up slowly, okay? So let's go back to sharing my screen. So let's go on to cuts. Cuts are actually something that you'll probably do more frequently. And cuts are also, as I said, similar to what I call a chirp, in that a chirp is sort of a NAF idiomatic cut. So we have the same thing that we had before with the taps. I'm showing you 5 different measures that have the pentatonic notes in them. And I'm starting with a note that is the same as the main note that's going to be embellished just for the sake of illustration. But you'll see here in the first measure, the grace note is on an 8 and it comes down to the 7. Right? So if I play the note before, 1, 2, I'm cutting. I'm cutting into the airstream. I'm doing it the opposite way. I'm lifting up now the hole above the note that I'm playing. Or I should say that I have that hole open and I'm descending to that note. Let me, I'm going to go ahead and come out of this. Let me stop sharing my screen, because I can do these for you and you can see what I'm doing. So again, I'm going to play the examples as they're written. The dotted lines are representing slurs, but again, I put them there because I didn't want you to think that the cut is just the grace note and then the note following it. So we start with the 8. Then we have a cut on 5, which uses the 7. I'm not sure how well this is coming through the internet. I'm doing it kind of fast. Then we have 4, and I'm going to lift this note to get to the note 5 and come right back down. So the cut is actually the gesture down. And then 3, I'm going to cut up to 4. And then 1, I'm going to go to 3. All right, now, in taps, I was saying that as long as the note before the note you're embellishing is above it, you resolve up with a tap. So with a cut, it's the same way, but you want to be below it. So let's say I'm doing this tap on 8 of the note 7. I could start on 5 and go to 7 and put that cut in front of it. In other words, I'm jumping up to the 8 and coming back down on the 7. That's what defines the cut, is that the grace note is a note above the main note. Or I could be, this is very common, you hear this all the time, I could be on note 1 and go to 5, and I'm going to put a cut in front of it, which is going to be note 7. I'm sure you've heard that before. All right. And as you'll see when we get to chirps, it's kind of hard to tell which is which. All right. Okay. So again, if you tap by closing the hole below the main note, you cut by opening the hole above it. Here's an example. Everything's under a slur. The grace note is slurred. I'm just coming up 4 notes of the scale. And then I'm going to put that cut, which is the 7 going to the 5 before it. Right? Why don't you try that? Okay, let's go to another one. Again, cuts tend to move contrary to the line. So here, so basically you want the note before the main note, the one that's being embellished, to be below it or equal to. And again, this line starts on the 5 and goes down to a 3, but then it starts to come up. And the note before the embellishment is below the main note, a 5 to a 7. So you would do this instead of a tap. I mean, obviously, you would have to play a 6 to do the tap, but you get my point. So let me play without it. Now with it. Go ahead. All right, let's move on to another one. Just like taps, cuts also work to break up a longer note. I usually use it on whole notes, but you can do whatever you want. If the note is not too long, like a half note, it doesn't really, it loses its effectiveness, I think, or it becomes something else. So let me play this without the embellishments. And I played it as a whole note. Now I'm going to put the embellishment in, and I'm going to use that cut to split that whole note in half into 2 half notes. Okay, let's go on to the next one. Both cuts and taps are only defined by how they are resolving, or in other words, what the main note is in relationship to them. So here, for example, I have 2 of the exact same cut. It's both a 7 going to a main note of 5. But the note before them, one is a 4 and the other one is a 1. That really has no impact on whether or not I'm going to call this a cut or not. And it doesn't matter what I call it anyway. I just have to give it a name to describe this. I could call it a finger wiggle and it'd still be the same thing, right? So let me play this example without the embellishments. And now I'm going to put them in. If anybody wants to see my hands for that, let me know. I won't go backwards, but I'll play this one in A. Here it is with the embellishments. Do it again. radically different to me. All right. Just like taps, cuts do not want to resolve in the same direction as the line. And in this case, I'm talking about if the note above, the note before the note you're going to do a cut on is above it, the main note, it's not going to sound right. So I'm in A, I'll stick with this for just a second, then I'll switch to the G. So here's the line. Now I'll put that grace note in there. It makes no sense. It sounds like either it should be a written note or somebody has fumbled and they meant to land on the 4 and instead they hit the 5. Let me do it in G. So what would I do there? I'd do a tap between the two, right? If I was trying to draw attention to that note, but I was moving from above it, I would come up from underneath it. We'll see other things that you can do that are different embellishments that will do that, okay? All right, let's do this in Little Crow Dance. So on the second page, we have on the top system here, the top little section, adding cuts. So I guess I'm going to have to pick a flute to play. Since I did that last one in G, I'll do this one A. So the first line here is the same as the first line in the last one, but now instead of doing taps, I'm going to do cuts. Okay, makes sense? Let me go to the second line. So again, I split up a half note, and I was sort of mixing it up whether or not I was doing it between repeated notes or not. Now let's do the third line. Again, I'll stick with A for this example. Notice in the end of this line, just to vary it, I'm keeping one cut from before. It's not necessarily the same cut, but since we've done before, I figured I'd just leave it in there. Okay, so. Again, I'm breaking up a whole note. And again, this is really awkward. You know, I'm just throwing a bunch in here. I wouldn't do it like this. And it might help if you're having trouble with these, relax your hands as much as possible. If your hands are tight and you're tense, these will be harder to do. You want to be very, very relaxed. You know, just letting gravity work for you sometimes when you're bringing the finger down. And then we'll finish up the last line. Now I want to point out here, so far in these examples, you'll notice that I haven't split up the last note of the tune. And I probably would not want to do that unless I really felt it really added something to it, because the tune is done and I don't want to embellish something that's done, right? The note just sitting there. There might be cases where I feel like I need to add a little motion to it, and I might do that. But it wouldn't be my first go-to idea for that, okay? All right, so now, let's see, what are we doing here? Oh, we're already done. Wow. Okay, so we've reached the hour. So we've just sort of scratched the surface here. We need to go to chirps, we need to go to finger slides, we need to go into turns, and then some other things. Any questions before I say goodnight? And if you want to push down your space bar and speak to me, that's fine too. Hopefully, won't get crazy. And if you don't have any questions,
Thank you, Scott.
that concerns me. You should have some questions.
Actually do have a question. You seem to not be a fan of trills. Is it because it's well, can you explain why you're not fond of them?
I'm not. It's not that I'm fond or not fond. What we're going to look at later next week is something that I call a double grace note. And for lack of a better term, that actually is a trill. It's a couple wiggles. So so a trill at its most basic is just one alteration back and forth of the finger. What I'm not a fan of, because they seem gratuitous to me, is when people are like, sorry. It just seems like it doesn't do anything. It's just this. So it's a lot of fuss and fury, sound and fury signifying nothing to me. And it's interesting in all the recordings that I have, and I have quite a bit. When I first started playing this instrument, I listened to a lot of people. I only know of one song that has a really long trill in it. It's by the big 800-pound gorilla NAF player. But even he doesn't do it more than just that one time. So it's not a few shakes back and forth. I'm not. I don't have an opposition to. I tend not to call them trills because they have this connotation with people to start shaking their finger right back and forth. Does that answer your question at all? So we're going to look at some stuff next week that somebody could say, "Oh, that's a trill," and it kind of is. But I call it something else just to separate it from that long blah, 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 right? So we are going to be doing some kind of a trill in some way or another. Let's see here. I think I've been raising my gross note finger too high. It makes it longer. Yes. Try not to lift your fingers too high. This is true about all playing. I don't tell people to hold it at a certain distance close to the flute, but the opposite is true. Don't hold it too high, right? You don't want to force it low, but you also don't want to go high. You're describing the same thing, but in a different way. Going from 4 to 5 note is awkward. From 4 up to 5, really? That's awkward? That should be one of the easiest ones. You're just lifting the index finger. What I would recommend for these, if you find the one is a little strange for you or awkward, just sort of play off it a little bit. And if you want to do taps, maybe if you're going from 4 to 5, for example, then start from 7 down to 4 and doing that tap. Right, or 8. As I said at the beginning, 4 is the great note, to note 5. Yeah. As I said in the beginning, you shouldn't expect that because I presented you with this information, especially as we get into next week, which is going to get a lot more difficult in what we're doing. We're going to get into double grace notes, triple grace notes, and again, I'm just calling these, they're not really official things. And then turns or rolls, these become substantially more difficult to pull off. And so, like anything, you're going to need to practice it. And you may have noticed, if you didn't, not looking carefully enough, but in the book, I actually have, on what page here? Two whole leaps, turns and rolls. So on page 74, especially, 75 is sort of peripheral or collateral. I have something called turns and rolls. And these are exercises I've done just to help people get used to the finger movement to execute a turn or a roll. And I got good at this because I came up with this exercise for myself, and I did it every day for years, longer than I needed to, just to really firm it in, right? Because these movements, like anything, and I'm sort of going back to my first webinar, which was called Tricky Bits, about difficult portions of music. To execute these physical gestures, you need to develop the neural pathways in your brain to send the nerve impulses very, very fast to your fingers. Otherwise, if you haven't built those, they're just doing these detours to finally get there. That's why when you first start playing a piece, it's kind of awkward and eventually it becomes easier and easier. Your brain starts to literally build neural pathways. You're actually growing the inside of your brain. And the same is true with all these embellishments as well, too. You need to have spent some time performing that physical movement so the brain can begin to grow those pathways. And that's another reason why I always advocate to my students, practice slowly. They have proven through brain research and brain scans that if you practice something difficult slowly, a physical action, you grow the pattern, you grow the neural pathways much stronger and in a more permanent way. And especially because you're not making mistakes if you're going slower. Because the brain, when it grows these pathways, it doesn't know that you're making mistakes. So if you're doing it fast and you keep making the same mistakes over and over and over again, your brain's going to actually grow this super highway for the neurons wrong to take into account the mistakes you're making. It doesn't know that it's a mistake. It just knows that that's what's going on, right? So if you always go to the wrong note, for example, in a certain piece, really slow down and really work on that slowly and slowly, because you're actually getting a muscle memory, but it's a neural growth to go to that wrong note. And you're going to have to so again, if it's difficult, make up little exercises. And you'll see as we go on in the book, in the embellishment section, there are exercises for some of these. Okay. All right, I'm going to check out. I hope that we had gotten to more stuff by the end of the session. So I will warn you next week, I might go a little long because there's a lot to cover still. I chose to kind of stretch this out a little bit because I didn't want to just blast through this and not have you have a chance to actually get it under your fingers. So hopefully that worked, and I apologize if I went slower than I should have. Anyway, I will see you next week. Have a great weekend and play some flute.